Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this weekend's edition of BookBytes. It's not very often that you have an opportunity to restore our faith in, one of the public entities, which is our soft sort of army, the police force, the South African Police Service. And imagine finding a book, a biography in that sense, that does more than that, not just restores our faith in a particular organization, but in humanity. A Man, a Fire, a Corpse tells the story of Captain Amos Maneta, a man who is most often referred to as the top cop of Soweto, as written by his son Rofhiwa Maneta, the author we'll be speaking to this evening. The book is a collection of the physical and metaphysical bruises collected by the author's father in his 30 plus years of working in the police service. Through his father's story, Rofhiwa Maneta examines the relationship between police and the public. Maneta's mix of journalism, remembered history, anecdote, and autobiography further discusses the relationship between South Africa and violence, while taking a look at what it takes to be an honest policeman in a department whose groundwater is corruption and maladministration. Rofhiwa Maneta is a Johannesburg-based writer and photographer whose journalism has been published locally by City Press, Sunday Times, Mail and Guardian, as well as internationally by the Fader and Vice magazine. A father of one, his work primarily focused on the intersections of masculinity, race, and music. Welcome to the show, Rofhiwa. It's wonderful to have this chance to chat to you about this important book. Thank you for joining us this evening.
And thank you so much for having me. It's great to be on.
So, to dive right in, I know that you do discuss the title in the book, A Man, a Fire, a Corpse, and there's so many examples of this and so many examples of the kind of work that, runs through the course of more than 3 decades of Detective Maneta's life. Just today, we got news of a young girl, a 4-year-old, went missing in Benoni. And she was found deceased today. And parents were looking out for, I don't know if you've heard of that case in Watford, Benoni. And you've got encounters of this kind throughout the story that you're telling of your father's life and the cases that he encountered. Speak to us about this burning kind of career of walking through the fire literally almost every day.
Sure. Well, I think, first of all, it's worth mentioning, and I mentioned this in the book, that I don't think my father didn't always want to be a police official. Like, he didn't, that wasn't his ambition growing up. He essentially wanted to be either, a doctor, a physician, or a teacher. But because of circumstance, things didn't really go that way. And he became a police official just by happenstance. As he tells it, he'd went to a job interview at some point, and then, didn't get the job. And on his way in the train, he heard, a voice that told him he should be a police official. So he always figured that it was some sort of divine calling. And I think that's what compelled him to work the job he did, display the kind of passion he did, because at the end of the day, he always believed, it was some sort of divine commission. But I think he's also someone who's, just naturally quite inquisitive. His personality kind of lends itself to investigative work. He just likes putting pieces of puzzles together. He's very curious. And I think that just sort of like nature lends itself to detective work. But that being said, I think the biggest reason he sort of pursued, the job and, stuck through it through 30 years is because he believed it was a calling.
That definitely comes through in many of the direct references you make through your conversations with him. And his strong sense of faith comes through, his spirituality, his strong sense of this is how he's survived and this is how he's alive to tell the tale, so to speak. Not just a calling, doing significant humanitarian work in a very courageous way. We ask questions about, does SAPS have the resources and what does it take? It takes this level of commitment from within the ranks to say, but I have a vision and this is why I'm here. And, for a human being to be able to so sort of stand through that over 3 decades is phenomenal beyond faith and measure.
Yeah,
you can comment on that.
No, I just mean, just to your point about resources. I think, part of the title, like, gestures at the lack of resources, that most South African police, that most people in the South African police service have to contend with. Just to give you, the viewers a bit, or listeners, a bit of context, the title is "A Man, a Fire, a Corpse." It alludes to the first day. My father was a police official. He was a constable, and there was a motorbike accident, and he had to sit next to the corpse and wait, for his colleagues to arrive, cordon off the scene, and wait for the ambulance to come and collect the body itself. And so, because they hadn't even given him like something as simple as a flashlight, he had to buy a newspaper from across the road, strike a match, and then light a fire next to the corpse and sit next to it for 2 hours. And I think that was representative of, most of his career. He definitely had the passion for the job, but he was always, working within, a very minute set of resources. He kind of had to be very inventive in how he carried out his police work. Often, arrested people on his own, just because of the lack of resources I was alluding to. So yeah, the title itself also kind of gestures or alludes to the lack of resources in the police service.
And I recall in many of the instances where he's needing backup. He goes into the station and he's like sort of waiting there, knowing he
Mhm.
has to catch that suspect, and there's no backup arriving, or there's only a single car available and someone's using it, or there were so many frustrating examples. And you write it in a way where, as a layperson, you already you're experiencing that frustration that this detective is feeling. So his commitment is not marred, but definitely stifled by this lack of resource or lack of will, maybe in some cases. There
Of
are
course.
many high-profile cases that you refer to in here as well. I mean, and, it's difficult to call it an illustrious career, but there's so much of bravery and courage with which these 30 years have played out. There are some high-profile cases and threats to his life sometimes linked to that. Do you want to speak to us just about some of that?
Yeah, so I think I allude to the first case, where there was an active threat on his life, was sometime in '98, if I remember correctly. He'd arrested a man called Banikwati, who was part of a syndicate in Soweto, very well-known criminal at the time. And that was the first sort of active threat my father got against his life. To cut a long story short, and without giving too much away in the book, I run through, the day they were meant to kill my father, and by a sheer stroke of luck, he managed. He didn't outsmart the criminals. By sheer stroke of luck, the assassination didn't carry through. And that's there are many other instances where he worked, other high profile cases, some that didn't even make the book. Um, and then there were active threats on his life. I think it's worth noting that usually the people who wanted to, to assassinate my father, or had a hand in, the assassination attempts, it was usually criminals who were collaborating with his colleagues. So yeah, I mean, it's just that, I can't really talk about the cases without giving too much away in the book. But to your point earlier on, there were numerous threats. I think if I added, even half of those, like, my book would have doubled or tripled in length. But again, when you read the book, like, you kind of see how, he has a certain paranoia. He's very, and it's gone into his retirement as well, has a very large preoccupation with safety, like alarms, electric fences, demands that everyone be back home by a certain time. He himself, never uses the same route when he's traveling. So it's just, yeah, it never really leaves you. And that, after 30 years of having, your life actively threatened, I think, yeah, there is some sort of like a post-traumatic stress, sort of like disorder that becomes attached to you.
This commitment to justice on the one hand, and the frustration of dealing with an administration where you don't know who to trust. So there isn't this kind of, it's not really like a thing that you assume everyone thinks the same way, even if they're wearing the badge. And so, I mean, when
Right.
we talk about the toxicity of the space, we are an inherently violent society, and we assume that there are structures in place that will help to buffer against this and to bring justice about. And then you experience an encounter, this mistrust in your environment that is supposed to be the structure of justice,
Hmm.
you know?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's also worth noting that there's kind of like that cliche or idiom, like the fish rots from the head. If you just have a look at, the last 10, 20 years, there quite a number of high profile, like police officials, like high ranking, generals, at some point, even Jackie Silibe, who, was the head of Interpol at some point, forget the head of, the South African police, was the head of Interpol, who had some very serious corruption charges leveled against him. And then I think what that does, the effect that that has is, a constable or someone who's just newly graduated or frustrated detective looks at that and they think, what incentive do I have to be, an upstanding, moral, sort of police official? If the guys who are giving me, my orders are cutting corners, they're cutting deals on the side, what incentive do I have to be a police official? I think I actually mentioned it as well. There's a survey that that they conducted about public service in South Africa, and the South African Police Service ranked the highest. That's the institution South Africans distrust the most, and you know where that you kind of get a very good indication of where that idea comes from. Like I said, from general to constable, you see different levels of corruption play themselves out on a day-to-day basis in the South
Right.
African police service. So I think that's where most of the distrust comes from.
And then you spoke about, well, I'm not going to call it paranoia. I think it comes with it's an occupational hazard that there would
Right.
be extra safety concerns at home. And your mom is very much part of that, creating a safe environment for you and your brothers, especially when you were much younger, worrying about the parameters around which you engage. But being a police official herself, understanding what the real crux of your dad's work was about. And that partnership is quite powerful for me. But also not telling you guys or not letting on that there might be an actual safety threat, that it's not just precautionary measure.
Yeah, yeah.
Speak to us about your mom and her, partnership as with,
Of
bringing up
course.
this household, this
Of course.
police
Well, I
household.
think, yeah, it is just worth saying that, like you mentioned, my mother was a police official. She retired 2 weeks ago. So she's no longer a police official, officially retired 2 weeks ago. Um, but I always say, I think my father could only be the kind of detective he was, have the career he was, because he was always certain that, my mother was back at home, sort of tending to us, making sure our homework was done, that we're in bed on time. So I think she deserves quite a bit of credit. And as you mentioned as well, like because she's a police official as well, even though she wasn't a detective, she understands the occupational hazards. She knew more than anyone else, one, the existential threat the job posed to my father, and number two, kind of like the psychological toll the job exacts on you. I think I mentioned it in the book as well. When my father retired, after his 34 years of service, she felt like it was the first time in 34 years she could breathe. She felt like she'd been holding her breath in for all of those years. And as soon as he retired, she felt like she could finally exhale because she thought, my dad would never make it to retirement age. And so, one, because I think of the understanding they had, because they're both police officials, my father could go off and sort of like be a detective, work his long hours, work a job as dangerous as he did. And there was a bit of understanding that my mother had because she knew exactly what the job was like. In terms of, how they raised us, they always said, they just wanted us to have a normal childhood. In their minds, like we could never have a normal childhood. If they came back one day or said there's a threat on your dad's life, because it just happens so often. If they made us aware of the active threats on my father's life, they'd be telling us every other day to watch our backs, and they wanted us to have as normal a childhood as possible. So while the book I wrote is about my father, I think my mother as well like deserves quite a bit of credit, for putting the family together. And I just think, my father would never have had the kind of career he eventually went on to have if my mother wasn't at home with us and my dad didn't have, the security or the knowledge in knowing that, I might be off working a case, tonight, but at least I know my kids are safe with their mother.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I really enjoyed your sort of, documenting the interview with her, and hearing some of her thoughts, or reading some of her thoughts around your upbringing and that sort of thing. I always say that, family memoir, biography, and, autobiography as well, putting these together is so important. It forms a social history. It's important for the family, for the next generation as well. So I always say, when you've accomplished something of this sort, congratulations, but also thank you for sharing it with the public, because this could have remained a document for your family. But it does restore faith, public faith, in the possibilities, in the commitment of public officials. In this case, a detective with the police force, or two detectives, or two police officials in this case.
Yeah.
To speak to one of the cases that really stood out for me, the case of Thatu Radebe, one of the more
Yes.
gruesome, I suppose, cases. Tell us a little bit about this young girl, and the specifics perhaps around the case, and how it was concluded.
hmm So this happened around 2004, 2005. So me and Tato were the same age. I must have been 14 at the time, and she must have been 13, going on 14. But we were the same age. What essentially happened, for anyone who might not remember, Tato Khatebe was a 14-year-old, lived in Soweto. She was gang raped, and just sort of like murdered in the worst way possible. I just don't want to be gratuitous at all, but she was gang raped and murdered in Soweto. And then my father, because it happened on a Friday, my father was actually driving to get his suits dry cleaned for the week ahead. And then he sort of like stumbled on the police scene. He noticed, there was a crowd, there were a couple of police officials. And so he came in, and he, sort of commandeered the scene. He asked who, what happened, sort of quickly figured out that, a young woman had been raped, and murdered and left for dead in a field. And within a week, he had arrested all five of the suspects, and would later, go on to have them prosecuted. But I think, what made the case stand out, one, was because of the brutality of the case itself. Like, she, Tato was bludgeoned to death, in addition to being gang raped. And she was quite young as well. She was 14. So, it sparked a national outcry at the time. And, everyone from, the Department of Education, I remember Panyele Sufi had a comment out at the time, Enji Mochicha, there was a lot of pressure for, my father to find the killers themselves. And, speaking to our earlier point, like, he was essentially working on his own. At some point, he got some information about a particular suspect, two suspects, and he called in for backup, but they told him backup was about an hour away, and he decided to go and arrest the guys on his own. And to sort of like create the illusion that he was with a team. He'd knock on one window and say police, then go to the next and sort of like change the pitch in his voice and knock on that window. And then within 7 days, he'd arrested all of the suspects. They went on to trial, and I think, yeah, most of them got like 25 years and up. But yeah, like, I think there are usually some cases that happen that kind of remind you of the brutality of living in South Africa, our femicide problem, our gender violence problem, and I think that was one of those cases. And yeah, my dad, working with the limited amount of resources he had, managed to arrest five suspects. They went to jail. And after that case, my father was essentially called up to work at the provincial offices to be a hawk.
And it needs to be said, I mean, as much as we expect and think that, the police service is to bring justice and to follow up on cases and that sort of thing, the informants play a rather significant role in bringing information through. And these are sort of unofficial members of the community, with a sense of justice, with a sense of social, justice, to say, well, this is how we can make a contribution. And I thought that was fantastic that, so much of, this comment made in that sense. And the kind of, putting their life at risk, literally, if somebody had to know, well, so and so actually told the top cop, those were the guys, or whatever. Speak to us about these informants, and the kind of network of informants. Obviously, these relationships are built over time. Informants also
Mhm.
wouldn't just trust any cop. Speak to us
Exactly,
about those
exactly.
relationships, if you can.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because I think very early on when I was writing the book, my father made it quite clear that, a detective, much like a journalist, you're always sort of like swimming in the slipstream of someone else's courage.
Right.
Because, usually you can't solve a case unless there's hard evidence, maybe CCTV footage, but usually you're working at a deficit. The crime has already happened and you're trying to put the pieces together. And my father always said, he was always swimming in the slipstream of someone else's bravery, someone who had said, I saw something and I'm willing to go on record, or I'm just willing to point you in the right direction. That might seem like a small thing until you take into account the fact that, in Soweto and in many black townships, there's an inherent mistrust of the police, and I think that comes up from apartheid. When if you're seen as impimpi or an informant, or someone who's collaborating with the police, you're just not, that's something that's frowned upon. And so to have someone who is willing to talk to the police, that's usually what helped solve my father's cases. And I think that's what I wanted to highlight in the book, because my father wanted to highlight it as well. The idea that detective work is nothing like in the movies, where you kind of have this rogue detective who just so happens to know how to put all of the pieces together. You're almost always at the mercy of an informant. And some of my dad's biggest cases, were essentially cracked because someone came on and said, came on, wanted to talk to him publicly and say, I saw so and so do this, or I'll come and I'll, be a witness to this because I saw something.
Yeah, that comes through very strongly, and it's absolutely stands out for me that it's if somebody could go beyond the potential mistrust that they might have for the police, also because you don't always know who you can trust, not just
Precisely.
because of the stigma that might come across of being of being a collaborator, but just because you could actually put your life at risk in multiple ways. So if, it speaks to a strong sense of justice, for
Mhm.
me, in that sense, and that comes through. Another question I have is you mentioned serial killers, the study around serial killers, and you mentioned the ABC serial killer, Moses Sitole, and the
Mhm.
Wemapan killer, and then later a newer one, the case of Jack Mohale. I mean, speak
Yes.
to us about these old cases, the newer one. I mean, we're still seeing this happening in society. Your women and children going missing. It's not that we've put a cap on this. So speak to us a bit about that aspect of pinning down, the psychology of serial killers and how that adds to the violence in our society.
Hmm. Hmm. So the ABC killer, obviously, I think most people would know him, Moses Sitole. I think he still holds the distinction for being South Africa's most prolific serial killer. He killed the most people. The Wemapan killer was someone who went around, and that's Cedric Mack, if I'm not mistaken, his real name, went around killing people with a hammer. And then Jack Mohale was someone who posed as a prophet, killed 16 women, if I'm not mistaken, and my dad was part of the task force that eventually sent him to jail. But that case in particular and serial killers are quite interesting because like the psychology, of so at the end of the day, my father says, most people or most criminals, if you give them over a long enough timeline, whatever crime it is, it could be hijacking, it could be murder, if you put them on a long enough timeline, most of them will, be repeat offenders. And I thought that was quite fascinating with murderers as well. He came to the conclusion that most people, because he's arrested, people who don't necessarily, fall under the serial killer bracket, but have, maybe murdered 3 or 4 people. And he was quite clear that, these people weren't methodical, they're not like the serial killers you see on TV. Most of the time it was down to police, sort of inefficiency. Someone's killed someone, one time, and then the docket got lost, or not enough DNA was, collected. And when you look at, even, Moses Sitole, the Wemapan killer as well, there are quite a lot of, sort of inefficiencies in the police force that made sure those people, were able to kill repeatedly, not once, not twice, but up to 10 and 16 times more. It's either, evidence that wasn't collected properly, or something even as simple as, the victim so happened to be Black woman, and no one cared enough, for the race or the class of the person who was killed to investigate properly. And so while there is I think a very fascinating psychology about people who, who go on to murder quite a lot, my father was always, clear. He said that, anyone who kills and sort of is afforded the opportunity to kill again, it's usually because, there's a police official somewhere who didn't do their job properly.
Goodness, you've given us so much to think about through this book and through this fascinating interview. Thank you so much for that. We've come to the end of our session, but I know that this is a book that many of us will learn from and will be able to engage in different ways. Rofhiwa Maneta, thank you so much for your time this evening and for the book that you've presented.
And thank you so much for having me.
And so there you have it. Rofhiwa Maneta has written this fascinating account of the life of Detective Amos Maneta, a man, a fire, a corpse. That's it from us this weekend on BookBytes. Until next weekend, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.